Hey everyone, this is Nick, your instructor for topics in world culture. And in this video, I want to review some of the major Western ethical theories. So here the goal will be to provide you a brief survey of some of the dominant lines of ethical thought in Western culture. And this will be useful as we contrast Western culture with non-Western cultures. Ethical theories and ethical ideas about right and wrong tend to reflect other more fundamental or basic aspects of culture. So in Western culture, there is a strong emphasis on the individual. So, for example, we have the idea of the self made man in Western culture, which is the idea of the person who has produced for themselves their prosperity, their success, and their wealth. This reflects the idea of individualism. And indeed, the major Western ethical theories embody this sense of individualism. As we'll see down the road, some non Western cultures do not emphasize the individual as the primary focus, and this is reflected in their ethical thought. So here I'm going to provide a brief overview of some of the major ethical theories. This won't be comprehensive, but if you've taken a philosophy class before, these theories will probably be familiar to you. Okay, so we're looking at ethical theories. So we're looking at different accounts of what makes an action or decision or policy right or wrong, good or bad, worthy of praise or worthy of condemnation. And ethical theories make use of principles or ethical principles. And you could think of ethical principles as guiding statements that explain the rightness or wrongness of an action or a decision or a policy. So treat others as you'd like to be treated is an ethical principle because it explains to you how you want to act in a particular circumstance. It says, when you find yourself in a circumstance, think about how you'd want to be treated in that circumstance and treat the other person that way. That's a guiding statement that you can apply in a variety of situations in order to figure out what to do. The Western ethical theories aim to articulate principles or ideas which help us understand what we ought to do when it's not clear to us, when we are faced with an ethical dilemma. So ethical theories help us solve ethical dilemmas. Ethical dilemmas are, let's say, conflicts in decision making that arise because there are competing values at stake. So let's say, for example, that you value relationships, but you also value honesty, and you find yourself in a relationship that requires you to be dishonest. In these circumstances, you might experience a kind of dilemma. Should I value my integrity and my honesty, or should I value the relationship? Ethical theories provide guiding principles for working out how to solve these kinds of ethical dilemmas. And what I want to argue is that the major Western ethical theories provide us different accounts of right and wrong, good and bad, by emphasizing different aspects of an action. So when we evaluate an action, we can emphasize and scrutinize different aspects. So here I've put up 3 different aspects of action. We have the kind of action. That's just the description of the action done. And some ethical theories will emphasize the kind of action. I'll say, torture is bad in itself, so therefore you ought not to torture. So therefore, that kind of action is morally prohibited or ethically condemnable. But distinct from the kind of action is the consequence of the action, right? For every action we do, we should observe that there's a consequence. Okay, so if I lie, there might be various consequences. Although we might want to say that lying is a bad kind of action, we might also want to say that whether a particular instance of lying is good or bad will depend on the consequence of the lie. So, for example, we might think it's different to lie to your child on the one hand and to lie to, I don't know, a terrorist on the other. So some lies, perhaps, could be justified by the consequence. And then we always have the intention of the action. This is distinct. This is the reason, motivation, or aim for doing the action. So here I've put up an example in order to explain how we analyze actions from these different aspects. So say the example of the kind of action I'm going to do is smashing the window. Let's say we're having an in-person class and I'm giving the lecture, and then I take the podium and I smash the window. Now we can evaluate that action just in terms of the kind of action it is. We can say, What did the professor do? Well, he broke the window. Is breaking the window good or bad? It seems like at first glance, smashing a window is a bad thing, so we might want to evaluate my action just in terms of the kind of action I did. But we should also see that for every particular action we evaluate, we can also think about the intention of the action. And when we think about the intention of the action, we think about the reason or motive for doing it. This might be revealing for our evaluation of my action morally. For suppose that the building is on fire, and in particular, the door to the room that we're in is on fire. In such a case, my intention for smashing the window might be to save the lives of the students, right? Suddenly, the evaluation of my action takes on a different flavor, right? It seems like I'm warranted in smashing the window. Maybe I'm even doing a praiseworthy action because I have a good intention. Contrast this with another example where I smash the window, but I do so because I'm frustrated because the students in class are using their cell phone. That doesn't seem to justify smashing the window. That intention doesn't explain why I'm justified in smashing the window, in other words. Now, we can also evaluate my action based on the consequence, right? We can say, well, was the professor successful in saving the lives? If we want to evaluate the action based on the consequence, then we evaluate the action based on what happens after the action occurs and what happens as a result of the action. So, did the smashing of the window in fact save the lives? If we evaluate an action purely in terms of the consequence, then whether I did the right thing, whether I'm praised for the action or condemned for it, will depend on the success, and thus will depend on the consequence. So different ethical theories emphasize different aspects. So we have, for example, consequentialism, the idea that it's the consequence that matters. And then we have other ethical theories like deontology, which say it's the intention of the agent that matters. A person can be good intentioned and bring about a bad consequence. And sometimes we still want to say that they were praiseworthy because their intention is what matters. And then in addition to all this, we might think about a person's character. And a person's character is made manifest in the aggregate of their actions. So we think about a person's character in terms of what they've historically done, right? We might praise a person's character. We might say that they're an honest person. And what we mean by that is that they're the kind of person who's regularly been honest. They've told the truth. And we learn about their character through their actions. So we can evaluate a person's action from all of these different perspectives. We can think about the kind of action they did. We can think about the consequence of the action they did. And we can think about their intention, the reason or motive for doing it. And then in addition, we can ask, well, what kind of character do they have? And we learn about the character they have through the actions that they do. So our actions manifest our character. All right, so here is a hypothetical thought experiment aimed at illustrating how we can evaluate actions from different perspectives and how different ethical theories will emphasize different aspects. All right, so I'm going to just explain to you a case from bioethics. It's a medical scarcity case. So in bioethics, philosophers often think about how to allocate scarce resources. All right, so what do we do when we don't have enough of a given resource? How do we distribute it ethically? So you experienced this perhaps during COVID-19. People in the hospital needed respirators for care, but there weren't enough respirators, so nurses and doctors had to make decisions about how to ethically distribute those respirators. And then when they released the vaccines, those were released with a distribution in mind based on health, and so probability of success. All right, so in this thought experiment, we're asked to imagine the following. You're a doctor, and you're caring for ill patients, and you have very little access to medication, and that situation won't change. You have 5 sick patients, and they're each sick with the same illness, but you only have 1 dose of medication, says the thought experiment. And one of the patients is very sick. They need the entire dose, or else they won't survive. And then the other 4 patients are newly sick. They're not very sick. And so they could survive with just 1/4 of the dose of the medication. And so, as the doctor, you need to make an ethical decision. Should you save the patient who needs the entire dose, or should you save the 4 patients who need only 1/4 dose? Many people who are faced with this thought experiment say, all things considered, without knowing anything about the particular individuals, it seems like the right thing to do is to divide the medication among the 4 and save the 4, rather than give the entire dose of the medication to the 1 in order to save the 1. And the reasoning is often thought to be that by dividing the medication among the 4, you save the most lives possible. In other words, you bring about the best consequence. So this is an example of thinking about the action in terms of the consequence. Seems like we ought to bring about the best consequences, and in this instance, the way to bring about the best consequences is to divide the medication among the 4, thereby saving the 4. But in a second medical scarcity case, a different kind of scarcity case, we might get a different result. This second medical scarcity scenario is thought to bring out a different line of ethical thought. So in the second case, you don't have patients who are sick with a particular illness that could be cured with a medication. Instead, you have patients who are in need of vital organs. And so you have 4 patients, each of whom needs a distinct vital organ, without which they'll perish. And you're also a primary care doctor. So it turns out that earlier in the day, you saw a patient who was sick with a basic illness, and you evaluated their basic illness, and it turns out that it was treatable and they're otherwise healthy. And in particular, their vital organs are especially well functioning. So you get to thinking, as a doctor, it's my responsibility to save as many lives as possible. Couldn't I kill the innocent patient and extract his vital organs and deliver them to the 4 patients in need? Wouldn't that be the right thing to do, since the right thing to do is to bring about the best consequences possible? Now, most, maybe everyone who hears this thought experiment is uncomfortable with the idea of killing the one healthy patient in order to extract his vital organs. And this seems to be because killing an innocent patient seems to be an action which is bad in itself, wrong regardless of the consequence. This is a different kind of ethical thought. It says there's certain kinds of actions which we can't do. Intentionally killing people is one of those kinds of actions. So if we double back, we can see that in the first medical scarcity case, we were focused on the consequence. What happens as a result? Dividing the medication among the 4 is the action which brings about the best consequence, and so therefore seems justified. But in the second case, we perceive that there's a certain kind of action which we cannot do, deliberately killing an innocent patient. This is a different way of looking at ethics. And what I want you to see is that both of these lines of thought are probably already contained within your ordinary, everyday ethical thinking. Which is to say, it seems to me like you probably think in terms of consequences. You think in general public policy should bring about good consequences. But you probably also think that there are limits to it. In other words, there are certain things that can't be done to particular individuals in order to bring about the good consequences. So we also have in our ethical thought a kind of limiting factor. Bring about good consequences, but avoid doing certain kinds of things to people. All right, so this medical scarcity case, like other philosophical thought experiments, just serves to bring out different lines of thinking in our everyday ethical thought. And it turns out that major ethical theories articulated by Western philosophers capture and emphasize these different lines of thought. Okay, so the first major ethical theory that I want to talk about from Western culture is consequentialism. Consequentialism is a range of ethical theories that emphasize the consequence of the action. So if we look at that map of the aspects of action, they say it's the consequence that matters, as distinct from the kind of action done or distinct from the intention. We should focus strictly on the consequence. So consequentialism says it's the consequence of the action that matters, and both short and long-term consequences matter. I think one important implication of consequentialism is that no action is bad in itself. A seemingly bad action can be justified by the consequence. So according to consequentialists, we're maybe not right to say lying is always bad, or that lying is a bad kind of action. For consequentialists, whether any particular instance of lying is justified will depend on the consequence of that lie. If you told a lie, but you lied to a terrorist and prevented a significant terrorist attack, well, the consequence of that lie is particularly good, and so therefore justified. So this reflects the idea that the ends justify the means. And the ends are the results of the action, and the means are how we bring about those results. So the end was preventing the terrorist attack, and the means was telling the lie. The means, lying, was justified by the end, preventing the terrorist attack. So there are different ways of phrasing this, and I think they all capture the same general phenomena. So if the end result of an action is good, then the means of achieving this end is justified. When we act, we should consider each course of action and weigh the good and bad effects that are likely to result. And the right action is the one that results in the most good and least bad overall. This is, I think, the way individuals often think about their actions, in particular, the way people involved in public policy think about policy decisions. The right policy is the one that reduces the bad outcomes and brings about the best outcomes overall. Now, a major version of consequentialism, the version of consequentialism that we'll focus on, is utilitarianism. This is defended by the philosopher John Stuart Mill. So Mill has as his major principle of consequentialism the principle called the greatest happiness principle. This principle says that the right action is the one that brings the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number of persons, each counting equally. So every time you act, you should think about the possible impacts of your actions. And in particular, you should think about the consequences of your actions in terms of the pleasure and pain promoted. And we should do that action, which brings about the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number, each person counting equally. So you should weigh up the pleasure that's likely to occur and the pain that's likely to occur for each course of action, and do that action which brings the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number, each counting equally. Now, crucial to utilitarianism is the idea that each person's pleasure and pain counts equally. This prevents favoritism. So I can't say, for instance, well, I'm going to do action A because action A is going to bring my best friend a lot of pleasure, even though it's going to bring some strangers quite a bit of pain. Your best friend and the strangers count equally under the utilitarian scheme. I think there's benefits and drawbacks to this inclusion of impartiality on the principle. I do think we often associate morality or ethical thinking with impartiality. In other words, we think it's unethical to favor one person over another in certain affairs. On the other hand, we also do appreciate the idea of favoritism or of giving special attention to people we care about. And so when we evaluate utilitarianism, we have to keep in mind this tension between its impartiality on the one hand and our psychological propensity for favoritism on the other. It seems fair to treat other people equally, but on the other hand, we seem to have a hard time doing that because we care about particular individuals more than others, naturally, perhaps even biologically. Now, finally, I want to point out a distinction that's often made between different kinds of utilitarianism. This is the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. So act utilitarianism says we should assess each individual action in terms of the consequences they produce. So, for example, does this lie, this particular lie that I'm considering telling, bring about the most pleasure and least pain? So for each individual action, we give a new assessment. We evaluate it in terms of the pleasure and pain promoted by the action, the individual action. Rule utilitarianism asks us something different. It says we should assess whether an action conforms with rules that bring about the most pleasure and least pain overall. So instead of evaluating each individual action, we evaluate rules in terms of the pleasure and pain promoted. So we say, for example, well, there's a rule against lying. Does the rule against lying, if regularly followed by all persons, bring about more pleasure in aggregate than pain? If the rule against lying brings more pleasure than pain in the aggregate, then it's the right rule. And therefore, when you're considering tell a lie, you should evaluate your lie in terms of that rule. You should say, I shouldn't lie because the rule against lying is the rule which brings the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number. So these are two different ways of framing utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism says, evaluate each individual action on its own. Some lies might be justified, others won't be justified. Rule utilitarianism says, evaluate the rules and make sure your actions conform with the rules. The right rules are those rules, when consistently followed, will bring about the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number. You should do actions which conform with those rules, and you should avoid actions which violate those rules. So two different ways of looking at utilitarianism. The benefit of act utilitarianism is it captures our idea that we need to evaluate each individual lie. So, for example, lying to the terrorist is very different than lying to your spouse, hypothetically. That's a benefit because it's a little bit more flexible, right? We want to be able to say, well, you should lie to the terrorist if they're about to blow something up. Maybe you shouldn't lie to your spouse about something that's marginally important. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, is less flexible. It doesn't say evaluate each individual lie. It asks you to think about what it would be like if everyone lied and what it would be like if no one lied, and make rules based on that idea. So that's act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism. In general, utilitarianism is an ethical theory which focuses on the consequence of the action. It focuses on the consequence of the action by providing us a metric for evaluating the consequence of the action. The metric it uses is pleasure and pain. We should evaluate the consequence of the action in terms of the pleasure and pain promoted. And the right action will be that action which brings the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number, all counting equally. We can frame this two ways. We can look at the greatest happiness principle by applying it to each individual act, or we can apply the greatest happiness principle by looking at the rules. We can ask, does this act maximize pleasure, or does the rule maximize pleasure? Two separate ways of looking at it. Maybe pause and reflect here on the advantages and disadvantages of each of these theories, each of these ways of considering the rightness or wrongness of actions. All right, in contrast with utilitarianism in particular, and consequentialism in general, we have a different ethical theory which emphasizes a different aspect of action. Deontology. Deontology says that the ethics of an action depends on what it involves and whether it respects or violates duties we have. So deontology doesn't evaluate actions in terms of consequences, but instead evaluates them in terms of what the actions involve, what they require us to do. So instead of asking, well, what are the consequences of lying, deontology will ask, what is the nature of lying? What does lying involve? And here you might say, well, lying involves manipulating others. And if we have a duty not to manipulate others, then lying will be bad in itself. It'll be the kind of action we can't do. So deontology formulates constraints on what it's permissible to do to others. It says there's certain kinds of actions you can't do. Now, I don't want you to interpret this as saying that deontology doesn't care at all about the consequences. It's not wholly impractical or inflexible, but it says that the consequences of our action can't be the primary motivator. Okay, so it's going to place a limitation on consequentialist thinking. It might say, for example, lying is the kind of thing you can't do, and you can't do it even if the consequences of doing it are good, because there's a constraint on our focus on consequences. In particular, deontology requires that we respect the dignity of each person. We must treat them as an end in themselves, and not merely as a means. So I'll double back to this in a minute, but when we treat someone as an end in themselves, we treat them as valuable intrinsically, as worthy of dignity and respect, as possessing human rights. And when we treat someone as a means, we just use them. We see them as a tool, something we can manipulate in order to gain a resource from. Deontology says that when we think about our actions, we should think about how we respect the dignity of persons. And respecting the dignity of persons means not using or manipulating them. So deontology construes of our duties in different ways. So there are negative and positive duties. Negative duties are things we ought to avoid doing, like do not lie and do not steal. I think here in the United States, maybe in Western culture, most of our duties are negative. Most of our duties are negative in the sense that they're mostly to do with avoiding actions. Like, I respect the dignity of my neighbor by not intruding on their property, not spreading false claims about them, not violating their bodily sovereignty and integrity, right? Not stealing from them. Those are all actions I avoid, and I observe all of my duties just by avoiding those action types. In that case, all of my duties would be negative. But we might, in addition, have positive duties. Positive duties are often described as duties of assistance, right? Things we're required to do. Help out the vulnerable would be a positive duty. If I have positive duties, then if I see my neighbor, for example, in trouble, maybe they've lost their electricity and it's an especially cold night. If I have duties of assistance, then I have a duty to assist my neighbor on that especially cold night, right? I think here in the West, we have a harder time justifying positive duties, duties of assistance. We're not necessarily thinking about duties in terms of an obligation to help. And you can see this by thinking about the way we think about charity. We think helping others is nice to do, as praiseworthy. We praise people who engage in charity, but we don't necessarily see charity as ethically required. So we could reflect here. Are our duties merely negative, or are they also positive? Maybe pause and think about that for a moment. All right, so the major version of deontology that I want to talk about is Kantianism. So Kantianism is a deontological ethical theory formulated by the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. The main feature of Kant's moral theory is what he calls the categorical imperative. So you can think of the categorical imperative as the major principle of his theory, just as the greatest happiness principle is the major principle of Mill's utilitarianism. Remember, ethical principles are guiding statements we can utilize to decide what to do, to handle an ethical dilemma, to evaluate actions done to us, to think about what we've done in the past, and to think about what we might do in the future. So Kant gives us a couple formulations of the categorical imperative, and I want to cover two of them here, because these are especially important for the formation of Western ethical culture. Now, these are a bit wordy, so I'm going to move slowly through them. I'm going to read it aloud, then I'm going to define the constituent terms of the principle and explain how to use this principle. So Kant says, act only in accordance with that maxim, which you can at the same time will to be a universal law. Okay, so the maxim of your action is how you would describe it. Right? It's the description of your action. So Kant says famously, imagine, for example, that you're making a false promise to your friend. You say, I'm out of money, I need some money, but I'll pay you back on Friday. And you make a false promise because you know full well that you won't be able to pay them back. So the maxim of your action would be the description of your action. So in this instance, the maxim of your action would be make a false promise to your friend. Kant says, take that maxim, take that description of your action, and universalize it. Imagine everyone doing the same thing you're considering doing. Imagine the maxim of your action serving as a universal law. Imagine it governing the behavior of all persons. So therefore, imagine all persons making false promises when they need money. Kant wants us to consider whether it's possible for everyone to do the same action. In this instance, whether it's possible conceptually for everyone to make false promises when they need money. So here we have the maxim, make a false promise to your friend in order to get money. And we have the universal law. We imagine all persons making false promises in order to get money. And Kant's conclusion is the following. He says, in a world where everyone makes false promises, no one would be trusted, right? Perhaps you've had a friend who's regularly made false promises to you. At some point, you stop trusting them. When they make that next false promise, you say, I know you don't mean it because you've regularly made false promises. Well, Kant wants us to see that if everyone in the world made false promises, we would have that attitude towards everyone, and no one would be trusted. And the implication of that is that we would not be able to successfully make another false promise. because anyone we made a false promise to would say, I live in a world where everyone makes false promises, and therefore I don't trust or believe your false promise. So it would not be possible, says Kant, for everyone to act the way you're considering acting. You're considering making a false promise to your friend. If you imagine everyone making a false promise to your friend, you'll see that it's not possible for everyone to make a false promise. Therefore, everyone can't act the way that you're acting, and therefore you shouldn't act that way, because it's not the kind of action all persons could do. What's the logic here? Why does Kant want us to think about every person doing the same action? Kant wants us to think about everyone acting the way we're considering acting because it requires us to consider the fairness of our actions. If it's not possible for all persons to make a false promise, for instance, then we can only do so by making an exception for ourselves, against a rule we hope everyone else will follow, because we need everyone else to follow it, because our false promise will only be believed if most people tell the truth. I like to think about Kant's categorical imperative this way. When I'm on the highway driving to teach, I'll often see people driving very fast. Maybe the speed limit's 65 and they're driving 85 or 90. And I think, that's not the kind of action everyone can do. Because if everyone was driving 90, the roads would be so unsafe. But that one person who drives 90 can get away with it, partly because everyone else is following the rules, right? And so they're making an exception for themselves against a rule they hope the rest of us follow. They can get away with that, driving very recklessly and fast, only as a result of the rest of us not doing so. And so they're making an exception for themselves. They're behaving unfairly. Kant's first categorical imperative provides us a formula for thinking about the fairness of our actions, because we think about everyone acting the way we're considering acting. So we can ask, do we want to live in a world where everyone acts the way we're considering acting? Or is it conceptually possible for everyone to act the way we're acting? And by thinking through that thought experiment, we can register whether our action is fair or unfair, and thus whether we ought to do it or not. All right, there's a second formulation of the categorical imperative. In this second formulation, I think is also very crucial for Western cultural thought because it helps us think about the idea of rights, and in particular, it has practical application in employment law. So the second formulation says, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. All right, what does that mean? At bottom, it says that every person has intrinsic value. Every person is valued for their own sake, independent of what we can get out of them. They matter as independent persons with autonomy and freedom and dignity. And respecting the intrinsic nature of all persons places constraints on our actions. We can't treat them as mere means. We can't use them or manipulate them. So, for example, Amazon came under scrutiny because of their treatment of their workers in warehouses. For instance, the workers had very little access to bathroom breaks, and they had to walk long distances in order to go to the bathroom. And this really violated their dignity, because we think a person's dignity is tied up with their ability to take care of their bodily functions, for instance. And so one way of criticizing Amazon was that they were treating the workers as mere means to their end of profit, rather than ends in themselves, i.e. workers who have dignity and respect independent of their place at Amazon. So we should consider how to respect the dignity of persons, and not simply what we can get from them. This is a principle you can use all day long. If I finish my lecture and I go to the grocery store and I interface with the cashier, I can think about how to treat them as an end in themselves and rather than as a mere means. I can think about the dignity that they're deserving and the respect they're deserving. All right, and now I want to talk about a third major line of ethical thought that comes from Western culture. This is the other dominant view. So in the history of Western thought, there might be three major lines of ethical thought which philosophers have elaborated on. The first is consequentialism, the second is deontology, the third is what I'm going to call virtue ethics. And virtue ethics comes from the ancient Greeks, as does many of our Western cultural ideas. So What's noteworthy about the ancient Greeks is that many of the questions philosophers and other thinkers grapple with today were posed originally by the ancient Greeks, right? Some of these questions are not answered. They were asked by Socrates 2,000 years ago, and they're still being asked by thinkers today. And I take the persistence of these questions over thousands of years to suggest that they're important for each of us to ponder. They're worth considering independent of the answers we get from them. Because as you'll see, they're not the kinds of questions that give rise to immediate answers or obvious answers. And in particular, they're not the kinds of questions which the other academic fields like history, sociology, archaeology, anthropology, political science, with their methodology, their strategies, can answer. These are questions which are more general, and so they're worthy of reflection by the individual. They're questions like, what is justice and beauty? What does a good life entail? What does it mean to be a good person? Virtue ethics is an ethical theory which answers the question, what does it mean to be a good person? Virtue ethics is based on the notion of character. Well, what's a person's character? I think we use the notion of character in our daily lives. Say you meet someone new and you're explaining them to your friend. You might explain them in terms of their character. You might say, well, she was honest and courageous, but a little impulsive. And when you describe them in those terms, you're describing different qualities or traits that they have, right? These are different inner qualities and traits that we possess as persons, which constitute our character. Our character is the bundle of character traits and qualities that we possess, which dispose us to act in particular ways. So our character traits shape our behavior and our response to specific situations. So if you take two people and you put them in a scary situation, a situation that requires bravery, and one person is courageous and another person is cowardly, well, they're going to act differently because their inner traits and qualities shape their behavior and their response to particular situations. And this impacts how we view ourselves and how we view others, right? We conceive of ourselves in terms of our character. We try to build better characters. We try to develop our character. Maybe we read self-help books or watch YouTube videos about how to shape your character. And we can also talk about our character. We could say, well, what I did last night, that was out of character. That's not how I usually act, right? And that kind of reflection can be productive because we can then frame how we should act in the future. And our character, of course, plays a crucial role in how people view us. They talk about us in terms of our character, and we talk about others in terms of their character. So character is this important aspect of the self. And this is something that we deal with, we address in our daily lives. So the character traits we have dispose us to act in particular ways. If a person has an honest character, then they're the kind of person who tells the truth and acts with integrity, right? And if they have a dishonest character, they're the person who doesn't tell the truth and doesn't act with integrity. So our character traits reveal how we're going to act in particular circumstances. And virtue ethics builds on this idea. Virtue ethics draws on an analogy between physical health and human flourishing. So Aristotle thought, for example, as one of the major virtue ethicists, that we're not born virtuous. We don't come out of the womb as a virtuous person. We can become virtuous, and we do so if and only if we exercise the muscle of virtue. So we become virtuous through habit and practice and by emulating others, just as we become physically fit through regular exertion. And you can't become especially physically fit and strong if you work out just one time or only sporadically. Physical fitness is achieved by regular exertion. And so too, virtue is achieved through regular exercise of the virtues themselves. So we become honest, for instance, by regularly telling the truth. Every time we tell the truth, we have maybe the temptation to lie. We exercise the muscle of virtue, the muscle of honesty, by overcoming that temptation and becoming more of an honest person. Until, down the road, being honest becomes natural to us, just as possessing the other virtues becomes natural to us. So, crucial to virtue ethics is this idea of human flourishing, or what the Greeks called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is this idea of flourishing, which is distinct from happiness. It's more like well-being. You can be happy and be well off, but you can also be unhappy and be flourishing. For example, if you lose a loved one and you're grieving, you're not going to be happy, but you still may be flourishing as a person in general, because grief is a natural, healthy response to the loss of a loved one. Right? So think about flourishing as a more deep, sustained, long-term concept than, I don't know, fleeting happiness. And crucial to obtaining flourishing, or what the Greeks called eudaimonia, is the development of the virtues. So the virtues are the beneficial character traits. They're beneficial because they enhance flourishing. They bring about flourishing for us. And we can contrast the virtues, of course, then with the vices. These are the behavior traits, the character traits, which harm us. So we get well-being by cultivating inner qualities that are beneficial to us. And we do so through regular habit. We're born not virtuous, but we can become virtuous if we practice. Now you might think, okay, so Aristotle thinks the virtues are beneficial because they bring about well-being. So it would follow, perhaps, that maybe we ought to maximize the virtues. We should have as much of them as possible. If a character trait is beneficial, we should have a lot of it, because then we'll be really well off. It's actually not quite like that. So Aristotle introduces us to this idea of the doctrine of the mean. For Aristotle, it's ideal to possess the virtues in the right amount, or what he calls the mean form. Right? So you can think of the mean form as something like the middle ground, or the average. And that implies that we can be deficient in a virtue, or we could possess it excessively. And if we're deficient or excessive in a virtue, then it's a vice, it's harmful. So when we're deficient in a virtue, we have too little of it. Like you might be deficient in iron. And if you're deficient in iron, that means your body has too little of it. And if you're excessive, then that means you have too much of it. So Aristotle says we should strive to possess the virtues in the mean form. And so here you have a chart which will explain this, but you can just look at the virtues. They're the mean form. So bravery. Bravery is a virtue. Being able to face your fears is going to help you flourish in life. Every semester I have students who are, for example, afraid of going back to school, because I work with a lot of adult learners, and they do so, they face that fear by having some bravery or some courage. They wouldn't achieve what they're going to achieve in their life if they didn't have enough bravery. So you don't want to be deficient in bravery, because that's cowardice. That makes you a coward, and you're never facing your fears. But Aristotle's crucial insight here is that you don't want to have too much bravery or too much courage, because that'll render you rash or reckless. And that'll also be dangerous. You'll be like the soldier who rushes into battle and gets killed and gets their fellow soldiers killed because they didn't allow fear to govern their behavior at all. So Aristotle says, look, fear is good. Fear is beneficial. Fear can indicate to you danger, but the virtuous person knows how to moderate it and look at it the right way. Take truthfulness. It seems like being honest is a virtue, such that if you don't have enough honesty, you're a liar, and that's going to be a vice, obviously. But Aristotle also notes that there are instances where excessive honesty might be bad. So you might be transparent or blunt to your friend and thereby hurt them. Or there might be other instances where lying is required. I talked about this earlier in the video. Maybe the virtuous person would be the person who is dishonest to the terrorist, because by being dishonest to the terrorist, they prevent the terrorist attack. If they were excessively honest, then they wouldn't know how to be dishonest to the terrorist, and they would do the wrong thing ethically. But as a result of their being virtuous, as a result of having a kind of practical wisdom that's cultivated over time, they know when honesty is important and when honesty isn't important. Which is very different than just saying, as maybe the deontologist would, that you should just always tell the truth because lying is always bad. All right, so here we have three major ethical theories from Western culture. We have consequentialism and utilitarianism. These theories emphasize thinking about the consequences of your action. What's going to happen as a result of what you do? You should think about how your action impacts others. I think this is a major idea in Western culture. This is one way we think about the rightness or wrongness of actions. But we also think about it a different way. We think about our actions in deontological terms, right? We think about how our actions treat others. We think about whether our actions respect the dignity of persons, whether they treat them as means or as ends in themselves. And we also think about the badness of certain kinds of actions. So many of us have the inclination that maybe theft is bad in all cases, or torture is bad in all cases. Or if torture is ever justified, it's only in very rare circumstances because torture is such a bad kind of action. This is a different sort of line of ethical thought, which is in sort of tension with the consequentialist thought, right? Because the consequentialist says, do the torturing if the consequences are important enough. And the deontologist says, torturing is bad in itself. It disrespects the dignity of persons. You shouldn't do it. So we have in Western culture, therefore, this tension between consequentialist thinking and deontological thinking. That's a major theme in our everyday political society. And then finally, we have virtue ethics, which looks at it from another angle. It doesn't necessarily evaluate us in terms of our individual actions, and it doesn't even really give us a ready-made principle, a guiding statement of right and wrong. Instead, it asks us to think about our character, and in particular, it asks us to think about what kind of character our actions make manifest. And it requires of us that we work on cultivating the character traits we call virtues. These are the character traits which will enhance our well-being, enhance our flourishing, and give us what the Greeks call eudaimonia.